Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for part 2 of the January 2023 Q&A series, and I haven't stuffed up the name of the year
January
just
2023.
yet.
Yeah, that's all right. You've done well.
First time. Whew, nice. Yeah, we've got part 1 on the channel, so go back and watch that if you want to see more questions getting answered by us, but plenty more to get to in this one. But before we do,
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by ASUS and their new ROG Maximus Z790 Hero motherboard, supporting Intel's latest 13th generation processors and DDR5 memory. This premium motherboard also supports next-gen connectivity for graphics, storage, peripherals, and networking, along with high-definition audio. Also included are massive heat sinks covering all of the critical VRM components to ensure maximum overclocking headroom while avoiding throttling. And for novice overclockers, the AI overclocking function has you covered, allowing you to achieve maximum system performance with ease. For our Australian viewers, the ROG Maximus Z790 Hero can be found at various retailers, including PC Case Gear, Scorp Tech, and M-Wave. ASUS also offers a club rewards program which allows you to receive exclusive prizes after signing up when purchasing any of their products. So for more information, click the link in the video description. Alrighty, Tim. After the market's poor reaction to the 4080 and 7900 XT, do you think Nvidia and AMD will continue to increase pricing for GPUs in the lower tiers? I think this is something you've talked about recently.
Yep.
Also, how much do you think the lower tier cards should cost? And how much performance should they deliver? So this is, again, I think something you've recently touched on in a cost per frame video.
yeah, the cost per frame and GPU pricing updates, we always like to sort of look at the current, where things currently are, because that really gives you an idea of what should be happening next up, especially if you don't want to see a product launch at the same price to performance level as the current product because you just wouldn't bother buying it. You may as well have just bought right now. It's an interesting one because, like, the first part of the question talking about will they continue this sort of poor price to performance improvement sort of thing, it's hard to say what they'll do because, clearly the current strategy, I would say, isn't working. But then do they have additional metrics that they're looking at to say, like, yeah, actually the 4080 and 4070 Ti was a huge success? Like, I'm not sure, but I would think that based on those cards launching and really only the flagship models being in any demand, surely that would mean that they have to do something for future products. Surely they can't just keep pushing out cards that no one wants.
Well, what alternative, if AMD's playing into the same strategy, it's like gamers are in denial for a bit, then they eventually just go, well, I really want a 4070 Ti class card. It seems to me, because we talked about this a while ago where they haven't got their memo that the mining boom's over and they can't charge excessive prices for GPUs. But it almost seems like the reason why we're seeing this in line with previous generation cost per frame is because, let's be honest, most gamers didn't buy a 3070. Most of them got snapped up by miners and, they'll end up on the second-hand market, I guess, at some point in time, or have been. So gamers didn't get to buy in to that generation, or at least by and large, gamers didn't. So they're like, well, we're just going to keep that same price to performance from the generation you couldn't buy in and just have like a lag period there. So if you want a GPU now, you've sort of got to buy in at that cost per frame.
And I think that hasn't worked because I think there are a percentage of buyers that maybe they didn't get the 4070 or the 3070 Ti, but they did buy something and that thing was really overpriced and now they've got no incentive of upgrading anytime soon. Because if you were thinking of buying a 3070 and then you could actually only buy like a 3060 or 3050 or whatever the card was, and then you bought that and you went ahead with that purchase, then yeah, you're going to be burnt for a little bit there because it kind of, you didn't get a great value and you just spent a lot of money and you're going to have to wait until the performance catches up. I think the issue is that the cards that we're talking about being launched in the next couple of periods are covering performance tiers that already exist. Like there's really nothing stopping you from buying a product in the performance range we'd expect a $500 card to be, which is going to be potentially 3070 Ti, 3080 performance.
Which is true right now, but by the time we get to that point in time, they will have hoped to have moved that inventory out.
Sure, but you can just buy a used GPU. Like there's nothing.
Well,
like
you could.
If you wanted a 4090, you can't buy a used 4090. Like they don't really exist yet. You really did need to buy that new product. Whereas, not everyone wants to buy a used GPU, but they're pretty cheap now. Like they're not And there's plenty of supply. Like if you want to buy a 3070 used, there are thousands of them being sold. So
that strategy will certainly be less successful at those price tiers where there are used alternatives.
Yeah, so I think as well, like people are so clued into performance now that if something kind of sucks in terms of price to performance, there's kind of like, well, I'll just stick with what I've got.
Yeah, there's going to be such a disconnect from the high end to the mid range if that's the case.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a difficult one for them because really what they have to do is make a card that's slightly slower but is way cheaper. Like that, they've kind of painted themselves into that corner a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to be weird to see how that plays out.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure what they do there, but certainly, in the cost per frame video, I was talking about how the next $500 GPU really needs to be offering like RTX 3080 12GB levels of performance, which when you sort of look at the data, it's marginally slower than a 4070 Ti, but significantly cheaper, which again, it's not something that I think these companies are going to be doing. But then again, if they're sitting on shelves for ages, then they're going to have no choice but to adjust prices. Like if there's no interest, no one's buying them, then something has to give there. So yeah.
All right. GeForce RTX 4070 Ti 4K performance over the next 2 years. Question. Will we see it dip below 60 FPS more consistently, considering it only has 12 gigabytes of VRAM? So yeah, most games, it doesn't dip below 60 FPS at 4K. I mean, there's like, you Cyberpunks, I think on the high preset, we went down to like 49 FPS. No upscaling, but that's pretty much what that did. I mean, games are going to become, hopefully, more visually impressive and therefore demand more hardware. I guess these sort of questions I get asked a lot, like, how will this CPU or this GPU work in 2 years? Will it do A, B, or C? And it's like, I don't know. Realistically, I guess the more important question would be, how will a 4070 Ti compare to a 7900 XT?
Yep.
In that period, like which one will age better? So which one would be better to invest in right now?
It's a difficult question.
And it's a difficult question. Again, like, do you expect and again, I know a 4070 Ti is a very expensive product, but then all high-end GPUs are very expensive these days. But would you be upset if in 2 years' time you have to turn down textures in the new latest single-player visually impressive game to make it run acceptably on a 4070 Ti, and then maybe you don't have to do that on a 7900 XT?
I mean, that would annoy me, but then, the counter to that is if a lot of games start using ray tracing in a more significant way, then potentially NVIDIA has
Well, ray tracing, though,
does use more VRAM as well.
So that may even be a worse counter in the sense that the 700 XT actually becomes the better ray tracing GPU. Because, like, in the games where the 3070, let's say Ti, that's 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, there's got to be examples right now where that has worse ray tracing performance than the 6800, which has 16 gigs of VRAM. Whether the 6800 has acceptable ray tracing performance to begin with is
pretty questionable.
So that may not matter. Anyway, I think that comparison is probably much more relevant though with the 7900 XT, because that can achieve 3090 levels of ray tracing performance. So it's a tough one. It's one of these crystal ball questions. Obviously, we're guessing. We can't tell you for sure. But its competing card has like 20 gigs of VRAM.
Yep. They're running it. NVIDIA's been running it thin in the last couple of generations. Yep. I think we'd seen the 3080 12 gigabyte from the previous generation was, didn't really have an MSRP, but it was effectively an $800 GPU. From a generation that launched over 2 years ago, and we've seen the new $800 card also have 12 gig. So it's not really an improvement.
No.
And we're talking about, the high-end cards do have sufficient VRAM, but if an $800 card has 12 gig, then potentially we're going to be running into issues with $500 GPUs. If they're only coming with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, that's probably not sufficient.
Well, traditionally, we would have said $500 is quite a lot of money, and you wouldn't want to be making near-term compromises with such a product.
Yeah.
But obviously, with these VRAM discussions, it's not like CPU cores. You can't. You don't get to a point where it's like you just don't have enough to play the game. Generally, you can dial quality settings down a notch, and not all the quality settings. It's like, admittedly, textures do have a big impact on the overall presentation. But you can knock down textures a little bit, maybe a little bit lower
Yeah.
texture quality, but then it's playable. You're back within that, let's say in this example, 12 gigabyte VRAM buffer. Whereas if you don't have enough CPU performance, and I shouldn't have even said cores because I'm getting sucked into that silly argument, but if you don't have enough CPU performance to begin with, then you can't really do too much. Like some games you can lower NPC count and stuff like that, but getting off track. I think on a $500 product and I'm going to get trapped here, I'm going to upset people, but I think for this generation where you have $2,000, $1,500, $1,000 GPUs, $500 is now gulp affordable. Like that's your I know.
I can see the comment section now. Steve says $500 GPUs are affordable.
There's no way for me to have this conversation without getting into trouble. I am not justifying $500 GPUs. I'm saying it seems quite self-evident that $500 GPUs aren't going to be massively impressive. They're treated as it's a mid-range budget type category now. It just is. You're not going to get 20 gigabytes of VRAM on a $500 card for this generation. It's not going to happen. 8 gigabytes to 12 gigabytes.
I think it needs to be 12.
AMD will have 12. Well, I shouldn't even say because I don't know, but I think it needs to be 12, but I won't be shocked if you see like $500 cards with 8 gigabytes of VRAM.
Which would be terrible. But yeah, I mean,
which will be terrible.
Because there are games that when the 3080 was launching and the 3070 with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, the 3070 2 years ago was sort of, in a couple of games, you could see the signs of 8 gigabyte not being
There's heaps of examples now as where you can cripple it if you want to.
The issue that I have with VRAM is that the consoles have 16 gig.
Mm-hmm.
And that means game developers will be targeting, if they're making a next-gen only game, which I expect this year, next year, there'll be many more examples of games that are targeting those consoles and not the previous generation, so PS4. They've put those in the bin. They're like, we're going for the capabilities of these new consoles. If game developers start targeting 16 gig and a $500 GPU only has 8 gig, that's not going to be a good situation. The high end needs to have 16 gig so that you're giving that sort of, we're giving parity with consoles. 12 gigabytes for sort of that new mid-range $500 thing probably makes sense. And then you'd really want to be seeing like 8 gigabytes for the entry-level mainstream products. Yeah, like you'd want the 4050 to have 8 gigabytes of VRAM.
I totally agree.
They're not going to do it.
I totally agree. And that's my opinion as well. I guess all I was trying to say was the lower down the product stack you go, I think I personally would be more willing to compromise on things like texture quality for future games.
Yeah.
But if I'm buying a 4070 Ti at what are they selling for typically? Like $800?
Yeah, yep.
That's MSRP, right? So that's the lowest price you're going to get one for at the moment. If I'm paying $800 US for a 4070 Ti, if I have to turn down texture quality in the next 2 years, I'm not going to be happy, especially in a game where it's a noticeable reduction in visual quality. If it's like you disable the textures one notch from unplayable to playable, it's like you got to squint and maybe you can tell the difference. Not so worried. But if it's a reasonably noticeable visual upgrade and the Radeon GPU can do it because it's got 20 gigabytes of VRAM and the 4070 Ti can't do it, I'll be unhappy. Kind of like when we were comparing the RX 6800 to the RTX 3070. I can't remember exactly what I said in my conclusion, but I'm like, technically at the moment, the 3070 is a better product, DLSS, better ray tracing, all that sort of stuff. And I think I said something like, the only advantage the Radeon GPU has is the 16 gigabyte VRAM buffer versus 8, so twice the amount of VRAM. And I copped quite a lot of flack for saying that. A lot of people push back. But I think now if we were to compare those two in playable conditions with the current generation of games, and then especially the ones that are coming.
Yeah, and we're going to run into issues
I think we'll find the Radeon GPU aged better.
Yeah, and I mean, we're going to get to a point where the RTX 2080 Ti launched with 11 gigabytes of VRAM, and that was quite a while ago. Mm-hmm. And then that sort of performance has become the 3070 with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Mm-hmm. And then this generation, that may be like a 3060, hopefully, tier of 4060, tier of GPU.
Yeah.
And we could be looking at the flagship card from many years ago having the actual adequate amount of VRAM for that product, and this generation, that card having 8 gigabytes. Maybe they'll even cut it down below 8, which would be really silly.
Yeah, surely not.
As performance of these cards increases, the VRAM capacity needs to increase with it. They can't keep it stagnant or go backwards. Mm-hmm. And people spent $1,200 on a 2080 Ti, and you're probably, hopefully, looking at more like $400 or less for a 4060 now. But you want to see improvements, and certainly textures are one area where games could definitely do with additional improvements.
It makes the biggest improvement, really.
Yeah, because it affects all areas of visual. So, it's going to be an interesting one to play out, this whole VRAM thing, because it feels like this year there's going to be a lot of sort of high performance, big flagship titles coming out that I imagine will be targeting next gen, sort of the next gen of gaming, and 8 gigabytes. We'll see.
Yep, that wasn't even the question. The question about the 4070 Ti over the next few years, but I mean, we can't answer that question, so I'll keep you posted. Tune back in a few years and I'll let you know how the 4070 Ti is going. All right, let's get to the next one. All right, how exactly does L3 cache cause such a big difference in gaming performance? I understand that it has much higher bandwidth than system memory, and I understand it being physically right next to the cores means data has to travel a much shorter distance, so better latency, which is all true. But we're talking about 96 megabytes versus 32 megabytes on a 5800X 3D versus a 5800X. When games use in the gigabytes of data, how can such a comparably much lower amount have such an impact?
There's probably a few things to talk about here. I think, yes, games obviously use gigabytes of data, but the majority of that are things like game assets. So we're talking about textures and audio, which use a significant amount of space in terms of like total game size, which really that stuff, doesn't need to be put into CPU cache. Textures, basically, they're just feeding that straight to the GPU. Audio, I mean, that can be processed directly off like a hard drive. It's so irrelevant to that sort of thing. We're really talking about like game logic, which is, the main instructions and the main code path for the game, which tends to limit things, and it needs like really quick access to memory. It needs to not just have high bandwidth, but low latency as well for accessing those things, so that the general engine of the game can be run quickly.
And you're only loading so much of that as well.
Yeah, that's right. Like, yes, the game executable may be quite large and it may have lots of dependent libraries and those sorts of things, but, there are still, it's clearly larger than the size of the cache, that the total sort of thing that needs to be put in there. So when we're talking about 32 versus 96, much more of that stuff can be put in. It requires less swapping in and out of cache. So obviously that is going to cause performance issues. And it just has more access to things that need to be accessed with very low latency. So if you had like a game that, let's say it had like 300 megabytes of data that needs really low latency access and is very sensitive to those sorts of things, then going from 32 to 96, huge performance benefits there. But of course, some parts that's still spilling over to system memory, but that's all down to like how the CPU optimizes and chooses what to put in the cache versus what not to put in the cache. The CPUs are quite intelligent about those sorts of things these days. Yeah,
that's right. So it's we see with the Zen architecture, if you have a Zen processor, a monolithic die processor that has an 8 megabyte L3 cache, then going from 8 to 16 is quite a substantial uplift. Then from the 16 to the 32 gigabyte, another substantial uplift. So I guess it's more like, where's the point of diminishing returns on that? And so far we've seen that it's not at 96 megabytes.
But we are in the diminishing returns from the perspective that the cache is tripled, but the game performance hasn't tripled.
Well, it doesn't double either when you go from 8 to 16. But having said that, that what I said is not entirely true, because there are some games where you do find the diminishing returns, where there's not a big performance difference between the 5800X and 5800X 3D. It's generally not newer, more demanding games, but it can vary. I mean, one way to sort of look at it is it's kind of like, I don't know if this is a good example, but like almost like VRAM, when you have a certain amount of VRAM and you run out of it and you overflow, which has to go to local storage, system memory rather. You filter down the various storage levels. Once you fill your RAM, you then go to local storage, and you're going through increasingly larger buffers that have less bandwidth to access. And so in the case of a game, that will introduce stuttering, but you don't see that with L3 cache, because it's still going to a relatively high next tier of memory buffer. But it's only until you filter down to something that's very slow that then it halts everything and you get mad stuttering. But in the same, the more L3 cache you have, the more localized memory you have, the smoother the outcome should be.
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
Which is why we often see really good frame time performance on the 5800X 3D.
Yeah.
And that's why. But yeah, it's similar to sort of anything else we see in the CPU, whether it be VRAM or RAM or whatever. When it's got to go to that next tier, it slows down performance. It's just that it's much more shocking, the difference you see when you're going from like, DRAM to an SSD, for example.
Yeah, of course. It has to do with, the different, I guess, it's almost like you could, if you lined up all the game data in a big row and you sort of sorted it by what's the stuff that's accessed the most frequently and is the most latency sensitive, then that's how you try and order it into the resources that you have. So the stuff that's really not used frequently and is not sensitive, you try and keep that on your storage drive. Then the middle stuff would tend to go into like your VRAM or system memory. And then the things that are used really, really frequently, you want to chuck that as much of that into the cache as possible. And it just depends on the game engine and those sorts of things as to what that profile looks like over all of the storage requirements. Like some games have a tiny sliver of, that amount of data that needs low latency access. Other games have much larger sections of that need the low latency access. And that's where you see the game performance. There's some games that are super sensitive, some games that have no sensitivity.
But I guess the question is, it's kind of thing, if there was like a gigabyte or 2 gigabytes of sensitive data that needed to be used.
Yeah, it's always beneficial to have more.
But even then, like that, going from 32 megabytes to 96 megabytes would make an insignificant difference because there's just such an overwhelming amount of important data. And I guess the point is that's not the case.
Yes,
so
100%. Because otherwise you'd see a lot of swapping and stuff. You still see some benefit, but it would be not as much as potentially other situations.
It would be minuscule.
But I guess it's one of those situations where more is generally better. I mean, I guess with cache, there's things like cache hits to be concerned about. The larger you make a pool, it can be harder to find the data within the cache. So you have to have very intelligent systems there to deal with that. But obviously for gaming, we've seen, generally speaking, it is a very important part of CPU architectures in terms of performance.
All right, Tim. What compromises are ones that you shouldn't make while building on a budget? So let's say building a gaming PC because,
I mean, the obvious one is power supply. That's always the one that I've gone to, building a budget. Your power supply can usually carry across many different PCs if you get a good quality one. And obviously, power delivery is important for the protection of your components. So if you're buying a really, really crappy one, and there aren't as many these days as they were maybe a decade ago, where there's sort of that minefield of really cheap generic PSUs.
That's what I was thinking,
because
there are decent, and we should make that distinction, there are decent quality, good value power supplies. They might not have all the capacity in the world, but maybe you don't need that. We're not sort of advocating that everyone needs an 850 watt, 1000 watt power supply. There are decent, like sort of 550, probably leaning more towards like 600, 650 watt power supplies that are relatively inexpensive that work okay. And you can sort of seek out the experts on those subjects to find out what are good value power supplies. But certainly the generic no-name, almost always going to pop as soon as you get anywhere near 50% load on them. They used to be everywhere.
They used to be really common. Fake ratings.
Thankfully they've largely died out. I know they still exist, and I know there are some cheap brands that try to put lipstick on a pig, basically, but avoid the generic, cheap, dodgy brand power supplies for sure. And then, VRM power delivery stuff on the motherboards. So I guess an easy cheat sheet on that one would be avoid entry-level budget motherboards with no VRM heatsinks because they generally suck and will limit your upgrade path. And they may even limit the performance of the budget chip you're buying by artificially power limiting what the board can do, especially for sustained loads. So make sure obviously you can research cheap, good, effective motherboards because generally the absolute cheapest ones save you like $10 or $20. Absolutely aren't worth it. So generic power supplies, naked VRMs, and really like SSDs without DRAM type stuff, especially if you're using it as a primary boot drive.
And I would generally say as well, like I've seen a lot of people who, in the budget class like to min-max their components, right? Like you go big on GPU, you sort of try and cut back on other things, and then people just ignore the display. And it's like, if you're getting if you're putting all that money into GPU to get big frame rates, you're trying to run at higher quality settings, but you're still using a low quality display like 1080p 60 hertz or something like that.
Yeah, you can still get good 1080p displays.
Yeah, you can still get good 1080p displays, but I think, yeah, if you're going for that big upgrade, like you haven't looked into it for 5 years or more, then there are some really good quality budget monitors these days that can get you like 1440p, which might be a very significant upgrade for you. And that's kind of sometimes forgotten. Like,
and that'll facilitate a GPU upgrade as well down the track.
yeah, it's like if you maybe cut down your GPU a little bit and then get a higher resolution monitor, which can drastically improve the visual experience of your games. And that's just something to consider, I think, with a lot of builds. That
Yeah, and you can keep that a lot longer.
Yeah,
Like,
that's true.
A
It
half
lasts a long time.
decent 1440p monitor with a reasonable refresh, like 120 hertz above. You can keep that thing for a long time.
Yeah,
Like,
100%. So yeah, something to
it's a
consider
good
if you're
investment.
upgrading.
Yeah, it's a good investment.
Why do you think for Ryzen, AMD mostly allows you to do whatever you want in terms of overclocking, but for Radeon products, they try their damnedest to impose every possible limitation to overclocking in a way that is completely impossible to remove? Interesting.
I don't know. If I had to guess, maybe along the lines of stability.
It's possible because the Radeon division has been destroyed a few times over driver issues, and obviously if people are just overclocking it, not realizing it's unstable, and then they blame it on the AMD driver, then that's not good.
The amount of times I've been reading through, I've had a problem, and I've Googled the problem, and I've gone to a thread, somebody's had a similar problem, and you've read down, it turns out, they'd overclocked their GPU, and that was causing the exact problem. Like, well, I haven't overclocked mine, why is mine? And then it turns out mine's something different. But the amount of times I've read through troubleshooting threads and the problem was the system was overclocked or the graphics card was overclocked, that was causing the weird display loss error they were having or the crash or whatever it may have been. So, yeah, maybe that's why they want to try and make Radeon GPUs just run as stock as possible to eliminate as many problems as possible so there aren't people complaining about Radeon GPUs crashing. That's sort of a shot in the dark, but it sort of makes sense.
They run pretty close to the limit too these days, most GPUs. I mean, CPUs are sort of similar, but I think with CPUs, a lot of the advantage from overclocking these days is more the sort of undervolting and tuning and getting it to run much more efficient.
Well, not underclocking, but
you'd think, why also isn't that available for Radeon's probably a valid question. But then again, like, they're also looking at a competitive market where for CPUs, Intel, with their K-series parts, also allows a significant amount of overclocking. So competitively, they kind of have to offer the same thing. Whereas on GPUs, GeForce GPUs are significantly locked down as well. So there's less need for them to offer these crazy overclocking features because their competitors not doing that either. So I imagine that plays into it. But yeah, I would think if I had to give just one reason, it would be the driver-related thing, trying to minimize stability issues and crashing so that the reputation of their drivers can improve.
I think so.
Which, in my experience, as we've talked about many times, their drivers, in my opinion, are fine. But obviously, if you're overclocking it and getting issues, then you're going to have a bit of a different opinion. So, yeah.
All right, Tim, I've made a few notes for this one because there are a few differences that I'm not going to be able to pull out off my head. I'm giving a specific example. But anyway, how much value does Z series, so let's say Z790 or Z?
It's Z, but the Americans will get a bit annoyed about that. Everyone else in the world, I think, says Z, don't they?
All right, let's move on. And B series boards, B?
I think B is universal. I think.
On 12th or 13th gen non-K SKUs. So how much value is it worth buying a Z series board over a B series board? Well, Z790 compared to B760 has twice as many PCIe lanes from the chipset. So you obviously get the same lanes from the CPU for connecting your graphics card and your primary M.2. But those extra lanes obviously allow board manufacturers to be more flexible with Z790, what they hang off the chipset, whether it's additional PCIe slots, M.2s. For example, you have twice as many SATA ports, so 4 to 8. So you get 8 with the Z board. You get more USB 20 gigabits per second ports, so a maximum of 5 versus 2. So that's pretty significant.
Yeah, that's big.
You get more 10 gigabits per second ports, so a maximum of 10 versus 4. So again, that extra bandwidth being used there. And then the 5 gigabits per second ports. So you sort of Gen 1 3.2 stuff, you get 10 versus 6. So it's possible to configure them with significantly more USB because you have more bandwidth.
More peripherals. So if you have a lot of peripherals,
yeah.
Makes sense.
Obviously, you've got to compare boards of different price ranges and stuff, but that's why you're paying more for those Z series boards, ignoring overclocking because we're talking about non-K processors. So yeah, if there's not a big price difference and you love your USB ports, which I can get on board with, then the Z series boards are probably worth buying. But that's the main thing. There are differences beyond being able to overclock, and you can overclock memory now on those B series boards, which about 2 generations ago you couldn't do that. So that's pretty cool.
Some of those B series boards they do have fairly limited USB ports on the back of the boards on IO slots.
Well, some of the entry level Z boards
some of the Zs aren't great,
awful.
But some boards you have only like 6 USB ports. Like once you add in your keyboard, mouse, like maybe a wireless dongle for a controller or something, you've used half USB ports there.
Yeah, and USB hubs are an option. You're splitting your bandwidth there.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically, important distinction to make is B660 boards will be very well limited without a heap of like splitters and expensive components added to them, which don't make sense. So you'll be limited with B660, and then with the Z series boards, they have the potential to offer much more, but they don't necessarily offer much more by default. So you might find that the entry-level boards actually kind of suck and they're not worth the premium. So they can be quite a bit more expensive to take advantage of all those extra PCIe lanes. Anyway, something you have to look into.
All right, and that does us for part 2. You surprised?
I am.
You're surprised.
We're wrapping it up, are we?
We are wrapping up, at least for this part.
Okay.
Whether or not there's a part 3 will be determined at a later date. But for now, 2 parts. Part 1's on the channel. You've just seen all part 2. You've watched to the end, which is really appreciated. Part of the 20% of you that does get this far into the video. What else is there?
Float Plane, Patreon, the usual stuff. If you want to support the channel more directly, get some cool perks in return. We have a Discord server where Tim and I hang out. Tim's always in there talking about games and monitors, and I'm just probably doing memes in the fun channel, stuff like that. Monthly live stream, which we're going to get together and do shortly. We do that once every month. Q&A stuff, which we're kind of doing right now. And I feel like there's something else I missed. What did I miss? Did I do everything?
I think
behind the scenes content.
Behind the scenes
How
content.
did I forget the behind the scenes content? I knew there was something else. So yeah, cool videos there.
Yep. I'll plug Hub Clips as well.
Oh,
Go check out Hub Clips, the channel that we've got that sort of splits these Q&As into smaller parts. So if you're ever wanting to reference something that we've talked about and you don't want to link to the whole video, or you're just more interested in...
Or you're trying to find like a specific question that was asked months ago. It's an easy way to find that.
Exactly. Or, you just want to not see it more in the podcast format on here and more just in the short format. Our Hub Clips channel does exist. It's a legit official channel. We do get some questions about that from times, being like, what is this? It is a legit channel from us. We don't talk about it too often. So I thought, you know what?
Good idea.
We'll talk about it in this part. So go subscribe to that. But that'll do. I'm your host, Tim.
I'm your host, Steve.
See you in the next one.